welcome you back to Cal, and that you had a chance to escape Philadelphia's terrible winter weather. I'm also happy to say that Dr. Ryerson was my master's advisor at UPenn, the best advisor I've ever had. except for, of course, Mark Hansen, whom I contractually obliged to say is the most best advisor I've ever had.
Is this being recorded?
Definitely.
We are very lucky to hear from Dr. Ryerson today. She's an assistant professor of city and regional planning and electrical and systems engineering and in the University of Pennsylvania. She is the research director of the Mobility 21 Transportation Research Center at National University Transportation Center and a senior fellow at the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Ryerson focuses on intercity transportation systems. She's published over 30 peer-reviewed publications in urban planning and transportation journals, and is the winner of the 2016 award for Best Paper in Transportation Research Record Journal. Dr. Ryerson was appointed by the governor of Pennsylvania to the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation Aviation Advisory Committee and the State Transportation Innovation Council. In 2015, Professor Ryerson was named Woman of the Year by the Women's Transportation Seminar Philadelphia chapter. For the seminar, Dr. Ryerson will tell us about how air service imbalances across megaregions integrate air and highway demands. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryerson.
Thank you so much, Ivan, and it is really just really great to be here and to be back and to be able to share some of the research that I've been doing recently with you. And I want to say right off the bat that a lot of the research I'm going to be presenting is research that is collaborative with my former PhD classmate, Amy Kim. We were lab mates in next door, and we've continued to be great sort of friends and colleagues, and we got together and we wrote a bunch of papers on this topic, and just really exciting for me to be here and present this work, and she's really excited as well. So students, I really encourage you to look around. Your best collaborators, going forward in your career are likely in this room, and so that just really brings me a lot of joy. As Ivan said, I'm going to be talking about my research on megaregional transportation and air service imbalances across a megaregion. And we call it A Drive for Better Air Service because I'm in a Department of City and Regional Planning, and catchy titles are very important, and I feel very proud for this one because I'm going to be talking about building air service, but also how people drive for better air service, literally in their cars. So I'm going to start out with a history and context for air transportation, very brief, because I know that there's no other way that you can hear an informed lecture about air transportation in this department. So I feel like it's really on me to teach you a little bit about air transportation. After I give that history, I'm going to talk about some of my research on the state of airline mergers and capacity planning, and how that's really brought us to this place of air service imbalances. Then I'm going to talk about airport choice in megaregions and how air service imbalances basically really integrate highway transportation and air transportation. This research is sort of particularly important to me because oftentimes I get the question of, that you study airports, and that's sort of the other. It's not really a part of the air transportation system. And Amy and I were particularly excited to quantify, why air transportation and surface transportation are very much, part of the same integrated transportation system. And finally, I'll talk about what some airports are doing to deal with their loss of service, which is subsidies in the form of municipal subsidies for new service, who it's successful for and who it's not. So I love pictures of old airports. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a history and context for air transportation planning. air transportation in the U.S., commercial air transportation as we know it really started in the 1920s with 2 congressional acts and a feat of technical excellence in the sense of the spirit of St. Louis, showing that commercial flight was really viable from a technical perspective. The 2 congressional acts were an act that allowed commercial airlines to carry mail for profit, and the second act required municipal governments to pay for their own airports. It was called the Dock Act. It was based off of the way that harbors were funded. So we have cities paying for airports, and we have airlines being able to carry mail, and then we have the technology that really enabled all of this. Well, cities really raced to build airports, believing that it was a key to literally put them on the map, right? That this was a way to become an important city, a national city, and in some cases, a global city. The certain federal agencies kind of pride on these urban boosteristic tendencies, right? The idea that cities wanted to compete with each other to become a more important city. In particular, the post office and the military were 2 federal agencies that needed airports. And they used to travel to neighboring cities and say, the post office, for example, would say to Cleveland, Pittsburgh is becoming an important city for the military. You need to become a post office hub. We'll help you plan the airport. You build us an airport, and we'll come and serve it. And that's how a lot of our airports were developed, was from this sort of urban competition. If this interests you, I highly suggest this amazing book on the history of America's airfields that sort of details all these things. Airports were also a tool for cities to become global cities as aircraft developed into being able to fly internationally. And in fact, when Idlewild Airport was dedicated in the 1940s, Idlewild now being JFK Airport in New York City, President Truman gave this really beautiful speech about how Idlewild Airport would promote peace and communications across nations. It's particularly relevant today. But also how Idlewild Airport was a tool for economic development in the New York region. It allowed it encouraged the UN to set up their headquarters in New York, and it really made New York one of the most important global cities. And so really, this speech is online on the Truman Library. It's a particularly sort of stirring speech in today's world. Well, when airports were being developed in the 1940s and the 1950s, the aviation system was highly regulated. Aircraft were small and very wind sensitive, right? Capacity wasn't needed on a large scale, right? And it wasn't necessarily even sort of feasible on a large scale. And all that changed with sort of 3 forces in the 1950s and the 1960s that helped bring the aviation system to the one that we have today. And the first is the jet age, and this is the development of jet aircraft that could really sort of technically take people across the country and across oceans, but also really made commercial aviation profitable. And so it really encouraged airlines to provide more and more service because they started to turn a profit. Another big change was in the funding of infrastructure. No longer were airports only bound by municipal funding. The federal government stepped in and said, we want to help fund your airport. We want to expand airports, and we're going to provide the funding for it. When cities then accepted federal money for airports, they had to agree to a very long list of grant assurances. These are still active today, and they sort of dictate the use of the use and the rules for public use airports. And actually, a lot of these policies are the reason why we have the system that we have today. Actually, as an aside, one of my colleagues in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Penn just wrote a book about the history of the bulldozer and how when the bulldozer was really the weapon, a key weapon of war in World War II, and at the end of World War II, there were all these people who were trained up on bulldozers, and there were all these bulldozers that needed to be put to use, and that became a push for the urban redevelopment that happened after the war. So in linking that to airports, and the airports were another place where bulldozers were put to use and really to grow the infrastructure. So really, I really like that connection there, and we keep talking about the development of infrastructure in post-war and how it's related to all that technology and sort of the learned labor force that resulted from World War II. And finally, we have policy. In the late 60s, the 70s, aviation became one of many industries to be deregulated by the federal government, which meant that airlines were allowed to offer, basically do what they like. They were able to set up new service. They were able to set their own schedule. They were able to set their own fares. And so a sort of massive increase in passenger demand and also airline demand for capacity at airports in order to increase their service. So these three forces brought us to the system that we somewhat know today, which is a lot of redundancy, and basically a sort of blanket of air service across the U.S. and internationally as well. So this is sort of the up to mid-2000s context. And when I was doing my PhD here between 2005 and 2010, I thought it was a particularly exciting time to be studying air transportation because the air transportation system was just experiencing this massive disruption, right? Fuel prices were wildly fluctuating, and the airlines were responding to these sort of cost pressures with merging. And we saw 7 major airlines merge to 4 and now 3 between 2005 and 2013, right? And so when the airlines merged, they eliminated redundancies. They reduced service in several markets. They stopped serving some of their hubs. I always start out my classes by asking if anyone is from Cincinnati, Cleveland, or Pittsburgh, or St. Louis, just so I can ask them about their experience of living in a dehubbed city. Every once in a while, I get lucky. Sometimes no one is from there. But the airlines really changed their network when they did these mergers. So while the airlines were merging, something else was happening on the ground. And that is that a lot of the capacity expansions that had been planned in the 80s and the 90s were actually being built. Please ignore the colors here and just look at the circles. Between the year 2000 and 2013, 17 major airports in the U.S. expanded their airfields or initiated plans to expand their airfields. Philadelphia, for example, is the only one up there that planned to expand and didn't expand. The other airports sort of initiated master plans, environmental impact statements, and went ahead and built new runways, new taxiways, and expanded their airfields. If we sort of couple this map with the experience of the airline mergers, there's really 2 results of this expansion of airfields and contraction of the airlines. The first is that the airlines chose to really intensify their hub operations at a few key airports. Atlanta, Charlotte, Chicago. These are cities that got new runways, and also the airlines decided to make them even more significant hubs. They added service, they added domestic service, they added international service. They really kind of doubled down on air service. As an aside, one of the things that I think is a bit concerning about this practice is how much more vulnerable the aviation system is to outages if we intensify our air service on a few key airports. Think of the Atlanta power outage. Back in December, this was like international news that Atlanta was inoperable for 11 hours, right? The Atlanta airport is suing the power company. This is, we're talking millions and millions of dollars. Delta Airlines claims a huge loss from that outage. Right. So as we sort of intensify operations, we're really asking a lot of a few pieces of critical infrastructure. Right. But that's sort of one result. That's sort of one result. So we have these few key airports that are really important. And another result is that we expanded the airfields of some airports that then lost their hub almost as they were being expanded, right? So St. Louis was a hub for American and TWA before it, and the plans were in the works when they were still a hub, and then they lost their hub and they were breaking ground, and so they expanded their airfield, and they have very, very limited air service actually using that airfield. This is a number of issues related to it. Actually, Dr. Bednarek, who I flashed up there, and also my former doctoral student, they research near airport communities, and actually the planning and the siting and development of the new St. Louis runway disrupted a very significant community right by the airport. So certainly it has environmental and sort of a human cost to expanding an airfield. But a sort of second result is a little bit of aviation economics 101, and that is that the airports charge the airlines something called a landing fee, and it's based on the airports set the landing fee based on the cost to maintain their airfield and the number of operations they have per year. So think roughly that's the equation that it's based on. So if an airport has a very large airfield and a very small number of flights, their landing fee is going to be relatively high. So let me just give you some numbers to really sort of drive the point home. The landing fee currently at St. Louis is $10 per 1,000 pounds of aircraft weight. So you can estimate the landing fee for pretty much any flight. So that was $10 per 1,000 pounds of landing weight for a flight. The landing fee at Atlanta is 66 cents per 1,000 pounds of landing weight. Right? It's just two airports that are very different in terms of the size of their airfield relative to the number of flights that they have. Right? So all of a sudden we have a few key airports that are huge and very important in terms of the number of flights, and then we have a few airports that are very sort of overgrown. Right, and they don't have a lot of air service, and they're sort of they don't have a lot of air service, but they recently expanded their airfields. So the air service discrepancy is really significant. And just a few pieces of sort of summary statistics. If you want to consider the difference in airfare between flights out of Atlanta and flights in the surrounding southeast, Knoxville, Birmingham, Huntsville, Savannah, airports within 300 miles of Atlanta. Just to pick on one, think of a direct flight out of Knoxville compared to the same direct flight out of Atlanta. The direct flight out of Knoxville is about 40% higher in 2008, dropping a little bit after that. The airfare in Huntsville, if you're comparing a direct flight out of Huntsville to a direct flight out of Atlanta, almost 60% more expensive out of Huntsville. So we have this really sort of significant differences in airfare that are also resulting from the air service imbalance. We think about the same thing for the sort of difference in the number of flights, how that's changed throughout the years. This is the number of departures only per year out of Atlanta. Birmingham had about 5.5% of this number of departures in 2017, dropping to 4.5%. The same for Knoxville, Huntsville, Chattanooga. Right? You can see this sort of, departures are dropping at Atlanta a little bit, but they're also dropping at these other surrounding airports. So this sort of imbalance is increasing between the large airports and the small airports, particularly in the same mega region. Right? So, to me, the 2000s and now in the sort of 2010s, there's really a new landscape of air transportation, and it's one of imbalanced service across regions and mega regions. So I'm going to talk about, sort of two broad questions. And the first is, how has the gap changed? How has this gap changed passenger choice of route, including, sort of multiple modes and airports, right? So how has the air service imbalance changed the way that people traverse their network as they define it from origin to destination? and how are airports responding to this sort of new spatial distribution of service. Okay, so I want to start by thinking about airport choice, and then sort of broadening our maybe our typical concept of airport choice to being airport choice across a mega region, because that's where I think we are. So maybe many of you are familiar with the idea of a multiple airport system because you live in a place that has a multiple airport system. In a multiple airport system like the one in the Bay Area, you have 3 airports that are generally, each airport is within 30, 40 miles of one another. And when you are making a flight choice, you may sort of easily look up multiple airports to search for better fares or better times or so on. Maybe you might not want to go to San Jose from here, but maybe you're willing to. And if you live sort of smack in the middle of San Francisco, you may look for all 3 airports and just sort of search for the best fare. All right, so the multiple airport system question is one that has been studied extensively, traditionally because metropolitan planning organizations, along with airports, will do surveys. They go to the airport and they ask people, they go to airports and they ask people where they live and where they're flying. A lot of researchers have sort of spent time studying airport choice in multiple airport regions, mode choice in multiple airport regions. What I'm talking about here, and what I think is really motivated by this massive service imbalance that happened in the 2000s, is the idea of interregional, what's called airport market leakage. The idea that somebody living in the catchment of a small to medium airport with relatively low levels of service will drive a very far distance to a larger hub airport with better air service and lower fares. Now, this is not necessarily, for me in Philadelphia, I feel like this is not necessarily a provocative idea. People go to Newark from Philadelphia all the time. It's much cheaper and has better air service. But it had not been quantified. It had not been quantified to date. So to me, the question is not, is it happening? But to what extent is it happening? And basically, what is the sort of contribution of these long drives to highway demand? I want to make an aside, and one of the other motivations I had for this research was I met with the director of the Northwest Arkansas Airport, and I was talking to her all about her airport, and she said, I lose 500,000 passengers a year to Dallas-Fort Worth. That is a really long drive between Northwest Arkansas and Dallas-Fort Worth. She said the fares are so much cheaper that people are just willing to put in the drive to get the better air service. And so these sort of numbers are like too significant to be anecdotes to me. I really wanted to dive in and estimate this. So Amy and I decided on 4 different study areas, and just for presentation, I'm going to focus on 2. But this paper just came out, so you absolutely can see the others if you'd like. We focused on 4 study areas based on some geography, and also based on the presence of having only one major hub in sort of a 300-mile radius. We didn't want to deal with the interaction of a multiple airport system like the Bay Area or New York. There's just too many dynamics of people choosing an airport in a sort of short range that we wanted to focus on these more 200 to 300-mile drives. Excuse me. So we chose Atlanta and the 5 surrounding airports of Atlanta that are classified as small or medium by the Federal Aviation Administration: Chattanooga, Huntsville, Birmingham, Savannah, and Knoxville. Right, and this is sort of the distance, the driving distance between these airports and Atlanta. And this is the sort of this is the interstate that one would take. We also looked at Charlotte. And these are the airports that we looked at connecting Charlotte. We also looked at Phoenix and Tucson, and Dallas and Shreveport and Oklahoma City. I'm not gonna show those. I'm gonna focus on these. And what we did was we adapted a discrete choice model estimated by a researcher named De Luca, who estimated airport choice in Italy for a for a megaregion, for people living about 200 to 300 miles away from 200 to 300 miles away from a big airport served by a smaller airport. This is the only sort of contemporary study of long-distance airport choice currently. And what we did is we adapted the model formulation and we sort of simulated the coefficients, right? So, what we were doing was looking to bound the problem. And what DeLuca did was he had two different models. One was a sort of utility model that captured the choice of a passenger between direct service in their hometown and direct service in the distant airport, and substitute the larger airport. And one model that captured the choice between direct service, nonstop service from the bigger airport that was more distant, and connecting service from their home airport. The models are a function of airfare, frequency, ground access distance. The model is a little bit different for connecting, but it captures all sort of the same things. In the connecting service, we deal with travel time instead of frequency because you have a connecting period, right? So we add up the whole travel time instead of just think about flight frequency, and also ground access time. And Amy and I simulated the coefficients to sort of capture different values of time. Basically, we wanted to say if you value time a lot or if you value time very little, right, what is your propensity to take this long drive, right? So we really sort of bounded, based on DeLuca's estimates, a lower bound and an upper bound of value of time and sort of value of ground access distance. Okay. And here are some of our results. I'm going to present them in terms of the number of passengers that sort of leak or take a long trip. And then I'm going to present it in terms of the percent of traffic on the highway that could be attributed to people taking these long drives. This plot here shows the percentage of total passengers that are sort of leaked to Atlanta. This is the dotted line is from Birmingham, and the solid line here is from Huntsville. You can see we're looking at sort of 30 to 35% of what is estimated to be the total market share of passengers who are in the sort of Huntsville catchment are sort of traveling to Atlanta to get a better flight. A slightly lower percent from Birmingham, about 20%. Just to put some numbers on this, the number of passengers that correlates to is about 325,000 to 750,000 passengers per year. So a rather sort of significant number of passengers who are sort of served by the Birmingham catchment traveling quite a long distance to go to Atlanta. We have sort of similar percentages here, and seen from Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Savannah. One thing that I think is interesting is this sort of dip in 2014, 2015. Just to connect it in advance of something we're going to talk about is that this could very much be due to some push from the airport to Savannah Airport to build new service, right, and sort of capture some of those passengers, get them to stay in their home airport and travel through there. So we're looking at a fairly significant number of passengers. We're looking at a fairly significant number of passengers and a fairly large percent of passengers that are served by their home airport, going elsewhere. So then, again, Amy and I were really motivated to link these numbers to traffic, to really sort of show the direct relationship between air service and traffic. And so what we did was we went to the DOT websites and collected the AADT values at points along the highway. And we found the sort of low point and the high point along the trip between the smaller airport and the larger airport. And we sort of pulled out these traffic points. And then we calculated, well, if everyone is driving by themselves or driving with another person, what is the percent of ADT that is attributed to people accessing Atlanta from these other places. And we found it to be quite significant, particularly in certain markets. So let's start with Knoxville, Chattanooga. That's Knoxville, TYS, and Chattanooga, CHA. Let's start there to Atlanta, which is right here in the center. There's sort of two traffic points, and we merged these two traffic streams because they end up following the same point. We picked a sort of low traffic point just south of Chattanooga there. And our estimates show that about 2.5% of the ADT at this point, just south of Chattanooga, could be attributed to people traveling from Knoxville or Chattanooga to Atlanta to take a long flight. So to a broader community, I have to sort of belabor 2.5% of ADT. You know, 2.5% of ADT is a lot of traffic, right? Caltrans is working very hard to reduce traffic by a smaller percent than that, right? So we're talking about a really sort of sizable percent of traffic. So that's the low traffic point. If we think about the high traffic point on this route, which is just north of Atlanta, we're talking about 1.25% to 1.5% of traffic, right? And you can see the sort of other. You can see the other numbers up here. The numbers from Huntsville to Birmingham to Atlanta are significantly higher for a number of reasons. First of all, this low traffic point is really, really low traffic, right? There are some rural parts that don't see a lot of traffic. And so the sort of denominator is low there. But the other reason that these numbers are very high is that Huntsville in particular is known as an incredibly high fare, sort of very inaccessible airport. And anyone I've shown these results to who has any family member in Huntsville says, oh, no one ever flies out of Huntsville. It's sort of a known practice down there because the airfares are so different. Because the airfare differential is so different. We came up with somewhat different, similar consistent numbers in Charlotte. This is in Charlotte. In general, our numbers are between about 1.25%, 1.5%, depending on it being a low traffic point or a high traffic point. We got to some rural parts and lots of sort of leakage from Charleston and Columbia. Sort of adding that together brought us to a rather significant number of ADT. In a more sort of quiet part of South Carolina. So these results were sort of really exciting to us in terms of being able to link changes in the aviation system to changes in the surface transportation system. So I think there are a lot of sort of takeaways and conclusions, and one is just these mega-regional trends, traffic, the environment, and economic development. And I don't have too much time to talk about them, but I do want to mention economic development. As traffic flees a small airport, they're losing out on fares, they're losing out on you buying a Coke at the concessions and parking, and all of these revenue generation sources from people going to an airport, right? And it becomes sort of a spiral of economic development loss. The second is this certainly has implications for new vehicle technology and automation. We simulated value of time, and the idea of if you really don't care about your time, maybe because your vehicle has some sort of ability to drive itself on the highway, right? Maybe you're even more predisposed to driving really long distances, and that maybe this is just the beginning. And that certainly threatens the ability of smaller, more medium-sized airports to build air service. And not to get too doomsday, but I do fear this future for airports of just a few airports that are so critical, and the other airports not being able to build any kind of sustainable service that stays. And finally, a big sort of takeaway to me is how this research links with a relatively new phenomenon of air service incentives, right? So airports are not letting their passengers just leave them without a fight. They are taking a really sort of proactive stance in building new air service and bringing in new flights and new passengers with municipal air service incentives. Back in the with municipal air service incentives. So just to sort of transition into that, back in the late 90s, the FAA and the federal government sort of passed some new guidance and rulings that airports were allowed to take money that they raise on the airport from, again, concessions, parking, and so on, and use it to provide direct incentives to airlines to launch new service. And this has all sorts of urban planning implications because airports used to use this money to fund things in the community. And in the late 90s, the FAA kind of closed that loophole and said, no, you have to spend this money on the airport. You can use it to, you can use it to generate economic development by providing direct incentives to airlines. This was from a congressional committee that was heavily influenced by the airlines, so it's not particularly surprising that that was the result. So airports sort of put together these funding programs to incentivize new air service. And they fund these programs through something that's called the non-aeronautical revenue. This is money that is not from aeronautical sources. So this is not from the landing fee from the airlines, but it's from concessions, parking, and any other sort of non-aviation related revenue. Other sort of chambers of commerce and so on might kick in money, but this is basically where the funding is coming from. It's not required. Only airports that can kind of raise the money can have such programs, and so that also creates some inefficiencies. And something that's particularly interesting to me is that nobody talks about this. There's no documentation, there's no database, there's no transparency or anything. So I couldn't, for example, just have done this market leakage study and then gone to see quickly, oh, does this airport have an incentive program? Are they incentivizing passengers that are, driving to Atlanta? There's no documentation. There's no documentation. There's no documentation about this at all. Let me just show you what an air service incentive program document looks like. This is Austin Airport's international air service recruitment program. So it tells airlines that if they're willing to initiate new service to London, to Tokyo, to London or Tokyo, if they operate it, a certain number of times a year, that Austin will waive the landing fee, the facility fee, and provide up to $400,000 in a marketing program. This is a lot of money that the airports are putting behind. New service. So, because there was no documentation, right? I wanted to know what's the scale of these programs. How much money are they spending? Who is spending this money? Also, I won't go into this, but are the programs significant in terms of their costs and environmental impacts? And then related to the sort of mega-regional effects, what are the factors that are correlated with the likelihood of an airport being supported by an air service incentive program, but being successful, attracting new service and actually retaining it when the incentive goes away. The incentive is only allowed to stay for 2 years, right? So, who's able to keep new service after it goes away? Because there was no database and no documentation, I hired a wonderful student to put together a whole database on air service incentive programs. I joke that by the end of his freshman year, he was the world's foremost expert in air service incentive programs. Nobody knows more about air service incentive programs than he does, because he read every single air service incentive program document that he could get his hands on, contacted all the airports, pulled them from the web, did whatever he could do at the top 75 airports, and sort of diagrammed all of this out, merged this information up with all the newly launched routes at the airports. Because airports don't disclose who they're giving money to. We had to surmise who they were giving money to based on routes that had launched and the parameters of their air service incentive program. And then we also sort of scraped and collected actual schedules of completed flights, right? So just because you accepted the incentive, did you follow through, right? Did you actually do what you needed to do to collect the incentive? So then we put together a cost model for all incentivized flights. This was a sort of rather involved model that I sort of cut out for time, but we modeled the cost for every flight, landing fee, facility fee, marketing costs, all of the things that the airport would have paid or waived. And we identified all of the routes that were in service or not in service by the end of our study period, which was March 2015. We also looked at all sorts of things related to the metropolitan area, related to the airport, and so on, so we could sort of study trends here. And in extreme brief, this is what we found. This is who, during our study period, had an air service incentive program, who was successful with it and who was not. So this map here is which airports could we at least locate have an air service incentive program or had one between 2012 and 2013. These initial results really, really surprised us. I mean, why do the huge hub airports of Dallas, Atlanta, Miami, Denver, right, have to have an air service incentive program? Right? It doesn't surprise me that Jacksonville and Atlantic City and Virginia Beach and Raleigh-Durham have air service incentive programs, but I was really surprised to see the big airports have air service incentive programs. Right? So that was sort of one takeaway. Yeah. The size of the circle, thank you, represents the designation of the airport as a hub, a large airport, a medium airport, and a small airport. So the FAA has these sort of predetermined designations for airports, and it's really just a way to visually see quickly, this is a significant airport, this is a relatively minor airport. Thank you. So these are the airports that actually were able to bring in new air service with their incentive programs. And this is the color is the total number that they recruited between 2012 and the first quarter of 2015. And again, the size is sort of the busyness of the airport or the status of the airport. So let's see who brought in service. Again, a surprise, somewhat of a surprise, or somewhat of a surprise that the biggest airports have these programs, but because they have them, they are the most successful at bringing in new service, right? You look at this map and you immediately see who brought in new service. Denver, right? Las Vegas, Dallas, Fort Worth, Miami brought in a ton of service. Minneapolis, right? These are the airports that were successful in recruiting new service. Who brought in nothing? Right? Allentown, poor Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Albany, right? These airports that are just very, very small, they could not compete with their larger counterparts who also had air service incentive programs. And I didn't go through the details of the model, but these airports spent $171.5 million on incentives, or spent/waived, on incentives to airlines from this period of time. And 40% were on routes that weren't retained when the incentive period went away. Right? So airlines paid for these marketing programs, waived all these fees, and only 60% of the routes remained when the incentive period was over. And here's who was the most successful in retaining routes. Again, it's always Florida, Texas, and California, these sort of big populous states. But even in these places, you see the discrepancies, right? West Palm and Jacksonville, not so successful. Miami was sort of wildly successful. Oakland got destroyed by Frontier, as did Denver. there were quite a few places that were really unsuccessful in retaining air service. All right, so sort of going forward, I think this is a sort of particularly rich area to think about international travel, right? So I did think about international travel in that past study, but we're in this sort of, I think, really exciting era of international travel where we have the 787 and the Airbus 350 that are making secondary cities sort of viable places to launch new international flights. San Diego has a direct flight to Heathrow. Austin has a direct flight to Heathrow. These are all products of incentives, but actually ended up being really profitable. So we have some sort of liberalized international aviation policy. We have new aircraft, and we have incentives that are sort of changing the landscape of international travel. So I think that's sort of a next step of really diving into the relationship between, airport market leakage incentives and policy, particularly in the international market. So I want to end with a sort of few things. One is why I get so concerned about airport incentives, and one of them is just the sort of precedent and principle. There's sort of zero disclosure for municipal funding for large public infrastructures, and it just really surprised me how hard my student had to work to get this information that I felt should be very transparent, right? And some airports would not talk to us, and they don't want any scrutiny about their incentive program. I feel like that's concerning. And the other thing is that I really worry that airlines and airports are the new Walmarts and cities, in the sense of airlines are now known to shop around and just go from Charleston to Columbia to Greensboro and say, what do you offer, right? I have one aircraft and a pilot, right? Why should I serve your airport? Right? What's your offer? Go to the next airport and ask them what their offer is, right? It's going to change the way we think of building air service. Rather than airlines think this is a viable market with passengers that want to fly from it, right? It's what financial incentive are you going to provide me, and maybe I'll stay and maybe I won't, right? Secondly, the FAA gave all airports this sort of very blunt instrument to create new air service. It's working for some, and it's not working for others. Amy and I are absolutely keeping this going. We sort of partnered with the New York and New Jersey, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and we were able to get their regional airport survey on attitudes and actual connections. So they did a survey at all of their airports, sort of asking people, where they came from, why they chose that airport, if they thought about traveling from another airport. So we're diving into that. And the sort of next step of coupling incentives and airport market leakage is to develop a dynamic intercity equilibrium model, something that we're in talks to do with another Berkeley grad, Eleni Kristova. The idea that you could reduce traffic by adding a flight somewhere, right, and doing a network model to capture all these interactions, I think is really exciting, and so we're working on that. Finally, I thanked my collaborators. I want to say thanks to my students. This is the expert on air service incentive programs. This is Max. He's about to graduate, and up there is Daniel Sa. He's graduating this year. He's my doctoral candidate studying airport forecasting. And I also just really wanted to mention my first doctoral student, Amber Woodburn. She graduated in 2016. She's now an assistant professor at Ohio State University. I met her when I was a TA for CE 93 back in 2007, and she was a junior here at Berkeley. And we just connected in office hours and in class, and Mark hired her to be his research assistant, and I got to work with her. I recruited her to Tennessee when I was a professor there. She was a master's student, brought her to Penn, she finished her PhD, and now she's a professor. She is pride of my career and a Cal product, so I particularly wanted to mention her. It is a delight to be back here. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll take questions now or anytime. Thank you. calculate the ground access time.
Did you collect the data, or did you, did you consider the traffic on the highway, or you just used a certain speed, or?
We just used a certain speed. Yeah, yeah. And that's why also we think this model needs to be dynamic, because the answer will be very different at different times of day, right? However, that is, I think, one of the things I learned from talking to the Columbus airport is that there's so low traffic almost at all times that it's actually quite hard for them to build air service, because there's really not that much of a rush time, right? You wouldn't necessarily think about doing this in the Bay Area or New York because there's so much traffic. These places have less traffic, but Atlanta is a big, busy city, so we definitely want to incorporate traffic. But right now it's very static. Yeah.
What do you attribute the shift that you described from a model where to the model where cities are now, or airports are now having to compete amongst each other for airlines, for service, like you described at Walmart.
Yeah.
Airports compete with Walmart. Is it just sort of the advent of these incentive programs, or what is there could it have anything to do with the overall economic instability in the country? Like, what are some of the bigger picture reasons for that shifting?
Well, I think when the airlines merged, they realized that they can make money by providing lower levels of service than they used to, right? Airlines used to oversupply the market. You oversupply the market as a means to competition. Actually, Mark and one of his former students had this great paper in the early 2000s that showed that airlines can increase their market share by increasing frequency more than decreasing fare, which to me just tells the whole story of aviation in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But that's not really what happens now. Now the airlines have sort of realized that the key to profitability is lower levels of service, higher fares, and they're all kind of continuing to do that. No one's sort of moving. So I think the mergers are really key, and now the incentives are a piece of that.
I think unfortunately we're out of time. We can
All right,
ask
I'll just
questions in
stand
person.
there. Yeah.
But on behalf of ITS, we would like to thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.